So it's no secret the dike is not currently in what we would consider a great shape. We've been undertaking rehabilitation of the dike in earnest since 2007. In a post-Katrina environment, the Corps of Engineers and other agencies throughout the country took a much closer look at their flood control structures. This one was found, and we had identified several issues with it even in the late 90s and early 2000s, but this was certainly right at the top of the list of structures in urgent need of rehabilitation. Our concern with the dike and the stability of the dike focuses on two scenarios. There's a scenario where there's wave action. The hurricane winds generate wave action and storm surge and causes some of that water to wash up on the dike, maybe a little bit over the dike in the extreme scenarios, depending on where the lake level is when it starts. The other scenario we're concerned about is what we would consider a sunny day breach scenario, where the lake is just at an elevation high enough that the pressure on the dike is such that the erosion and piping that develops as a result eventually causes the dike to fail. So rehabilitation is meant to address both of those scenarios. We are concerned about the conditions coming together that could present problems. Past events have presented those problems when we've seen the lake rise above elevation 17 and a half. The hurricanes of the 1920s, specifically there was a hurricane in 1926 and 1928, overwhelmed those structures. The lake rose and overwhelmed those minimal flood fortifications and killed an estimated 3,000 people is the most common figure that I've seen. No one really knows for sure. The water naturally wants to flow south, and so the federal government, through the duly elected representatives in Congress, authorized the Corps of Engineers. Early 1930s, they passed a navigation bill, and that said, let's create the Okeechobee waterway. Let's use the material that we dredge, put it alongside the south banks of Lake Okeechobee, and then we'll have a more robust flood protection system. Nod, nod, wink, wink, but we won't call it flood control. Certainly, it is not just the dike, but the whole flood control system and the water management system in South Florida makes it possible for an economy to prosper, an economy that has now resulted in roughly 8 million people living in all of the communities on both coasts in South Florida. And so certainly the question would be raised, if the dike wasn't here, yes, the water would be able to flow south, but would this amount of people and this type of economy be able to flourish here? So the system does great at what it was built for flood control. Now, unfortunately, the system was designed at a time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s where environmental protection was not as valued as it is today. In terms of Corps of Engineers' role in sea level rise in general, the Corps has been instructed to consider sea level rise scenarios as they plan for future projects. Certainly we take it into consideration in our planning efforts and assumptions, but right now I'm not aware of any authorities that we have to do anything to like help Miami Beach or anything like that in terms of sea level rise. So that when we did our study of the rehabilitation of the dike, we took a quick peek at it, didn't seem to think that there was going to be any effects this far away from either the Gulf or the Atlantic Ocean or Florida Bay or any of the other bodies of water that might creep inland.
One of the writers talked about 1928 hurricane when the lake turned into an ocean.
Well, it has similar characteristics to an ocean when you get a strong wind on it, because it's just that large.
It looks awfully strong, but...
Well, and that's a great point, because to look at it, when you drive on Highway 27 between South Bay and Clewiston, it's right next to the highway. And you're like, what's all the fuss about? This looks like it can weather anything. Our concern is the seepage, and the seepage is not readily visible. It's occurring inside the dike, the seepage and the erosion that's taking place, and the way it was constructed, the soil wasn't compacted to help reduce those sorts of things, and so it presents problems for us today. Our goal, certainly in a post-Katrina environment, is The Corps doesn't want to go through that, doesn't want to put the citizens that we serve through anything like that either. And how do we engage? And it's a really tricky business. You want to communicate that risk will always be present, even with the most robust structures. There's no structure that is completely foolproof. But yeah, you want to inform them that we have a high degree of confidence in many of the structures. This particular one, we have tried to communicate as best as we can that our confidence is a little shaky on this one, especially if the lake gets to elevated levels. And that's one of the reasons that when we're looking at algae and having to do water releases and manage the water, I mean, these are bad choices that we're put in a situation to make. We don't want to make water releases that result or have the potential to result in negative environmental impacts.
Apparently in 1928 there was a 500+ foot breach. Can you imagine that ever happening with all that you've done here?
There are still portions of the dike that are weak, so certainly, I grew up in the Midwest, so I understand that levees and the power of water and the power of moving water in large quantities of it is not to be underestimated. Would I imagine a breach of that nature taking place in the spot we've reinforced? I would think it highly unlikely. Would I imagine it in the spots we haven't reinforced that are still on the south end of the lake, again, where we talked about earlier, the water wants to go there anyway? Sure. I don't think that's far-fetched. If the lake got high enough, and if the erosion was allowed to progress, then sure, I could see a scenario where a large hole, 500 feet, I don't know. I'm not that familiar with the physics of soil, but it's not far-fetched. 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 It's not far-fetched.
St. Lucie River, the beautiful St. Lucie River that has been connected to Lake Okeechobee since 1923. And that's what allows the water to come in from the C-44 canal, which they connected to Lake Okeechobee. And all of these canals will be affected as sea level rise occurs in South Florida because they will not be functioning in their normal way when the groundwater pushes the water up higher. So they're going to have a lot of work to do. And when that's open, as much as 10,000 cubic feet per second have come through in the past, just pushing water into the river full of toxic algae and other nutrients and pollution. And it has silted our waterway, destroyed our ecosystem, because until you see it like this, you just can't appreciate the vastness of the system and how close, the lake is to all this agriculture and to all the people, and also how everywhere you look is the hand of humankind.
Oh, how are you today, Jackie?
I'm fine, thank you very much.
And where do we find ourselves today?
We find ourselves in the beautiful town of Sewells Point, Florida. The algae blooms were horrendous, and the algae blooms took over the river. It was like a St. Patrick's Day prank in New York, because you could see, no kidding, green, just like the green grass we're sitting on, all across the river. I mean, people were just beside themselves wondering what was going on. You take your walk and you're looking out over the river and it's green, and it was toxic algae. You could smell it. It was very bothersome to your sinuses, your eyes. It was very frightening, and thankfully the Corps started to cut back on the releases and to do what they call pulse releasing, to give the water here a chance to get flushed. And as soon as they did that, it started to let off. But it's a problem we deal with all the time. Major health problem. These are serious issues, and they are exacerbated by climate change and sea level rise, and we've got to work on them. Since about 2012, and I paid a lot of attention to this because I served on the Souls Point Commission as a commissioner and mayor from 2008 to 2016, and we started having much higher tides than ever noticed before during the super full moons, the king tides, they're called, mostly in October. And you can see the water come up right through the grates, through the drainage areas, and it just slowly comes up, and it can stay for as long as 3 weeks. At about, I get out of my car to check sometimes if I have on plastic shoes like my Crocs, and it goes right up to about my knee. So it was a true shift. It was a true change to start seeing the consistency of these high tides. We have flooding. We've always had flooding in the low areas, and the town's worked with that over the years, but something's different. Something changed. There aren't studies because people don't want to deal with this, and government officials don't want to deal with this, and residents don't want to deal with this. I think that's the truth, because once you start really talking about it, you can start talking about lowering property values that used to be very high. All waterfront is not going to be super desirable waterfront in the future, and for a community like ours, that's a big deal. Not consciously, you hear rumblings with certain groups of people talking, but it's not something that is in the press or in town meetings, or I think here in, I'll call us the Northern Everglades, we're kind of behind the curve. Miami Beach is all into it, and the consortium of Monroe, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County, they've even got government entities within their agencies dealing with these issues. We don't. Stewart is the sailfish capital of the world. It's big business, and that, of course, is why we fight so hard against the releases from Lake Okeechobee and the other canals that exacerbate the toxic algae that comes out of Lake Okeechobee. Martin County is primarily a Republican county, and it has been since the late 80s.
And you recently ran for the commission.
I did. I'm a registered Republican. Republicans have a huge environmental history, and what I look to is I want to reclaim that for the party, because I think the party needs that to reach the future. You can't have a foot in the future if you don't care about your environment. I think that Governor Rick Scott, he's a businessman, and talking about climate change was just not good for business. Just like I said earlier, it's not good for sales, real estate sales. I sold real estate for 10 years. It's not good for sales to talk about things like that. And it's let's be real, whether we like it or not, it's probably not going to affect us as much who are going to be alive the next 10 to 20 years. And so you think, it's really not my problem. But that's not responsible. We need to be thinking about the problems for the young people in the future. It's happening now. But if you are in a political position, and you have
if you live inland.
And you live inland, and you have 4 years, and sea level rise is your topic, you don't get a lot of bang for your buck sometimes, because you're only, that's the problem, is we're only thinking about the short term instead of the long term. These are issues that, like you said, are happening today. Joe Negron is
a
Republican. And he is somebody who has really stepped up. And
he's the head of the Senate.
Yes, he's the president of the Senate. And Joe Negron took a lot of slack, but I think it's all going to help his career in the long run, because he pushed very hard for a reservoir, to resurrect the reservoir, which was part of the original SERP program in the Everglades agricultural area. The Everglades agricultural area is the 700,000 acres right south of Lake Okeechobee that totally cuts off the water between Shingle Creek by Orlando that used to run all the way down to Florida Bay. As soon as the advocates started to make it a economic issue, and of course people started to go, they're not making this up. Of course this is an economic issue.
Because the fact of the algae is here. The fact of the rising water is here.
Yes, they're not just screaming, being unreasonable. This is economics. This is real. And then there was a lot more traction, and many people in the state legislature who I think had not paid attention before, who kind of were like, oh gosh, there are those people screaming about Lake Okeechobee again, started to really, and when they saw the pictures, it's bad for business. And Rick Scott being the king of business for the state of Florida, these people started to make deals to make these things happen. We're going to have to start making hard choices on what we're going to do. And the government is going to have, all you have to do is look at your topo maps and figure out, where the lowest areas are, where your highest areas are. Like Sewell's Point's easy. Our lowest areas are on the east, our highest points are on the west. We'll have to start making decisions like, do we want to pay $2 million, which is a lot for our small city, to fix Sewell's Point Road if we know it's going to be underwater? And is that responsible to spend that much money? Or they might decide they're going to lift the road. But if they lift the road, that'll impact the views of the people that live now, and maybe in the future, as has happened with FEMA, we lifted houses. We lifted 13 houses with a $3.2 million grant from the federal government because of flooding and repetitive flood loss here. Half of our homes are in a flood zone here, and people were also like, why are the wealthy people getting money to raise their houses? And not everybody's wealthy here, but there are plenty of people who are. And I think there'll be other grants in the future, where the federal government will be helping local governments to buy out lands that are really low. And then if you are really, really rich, let's face it, and you don't care about insurance and you want to live on the edge of a peninsula and know that your house is going to be underwater and you want to put high stilts up, people will be allowed to do that. But I think a lot of people will end up selling their land to the government. We called it our FEMA program with the 13 houses that qualified to be raised up. That was encouraged by the federal government because it's cheaper for them to raise the houses than it is to keep paying out the repetitive flood losses. It's in human nature to be in denial until something really happens. But I think people there are lots of people, and there are some very wealthy people, that just because those people have choices that I bring them up, and they have decided to move away from the coast. They have decided to move into the interior, closer to Palm City, where they feel much safer. And also because when you're looking at your insurance, you're paying massively more than you pay over there. It's that one day that you look in the mirror and you go, wow, I'm really getting gray. And it's just like your hair growing. All of these things with sea level rise, it's happening around us all the time, just like our hair growing. But one day we will wake up and we will say to ourselves, oh my gosh, it's here. It's here, and I have to make a decision. Are we going to move away? Are we going to put the house on the market? And people who are thinking ahead are doing that now. What happened was about 5 years ago, because they've been updating the FEMA maps, which is a big deal because it affects your, how much people are paying for flood insurance. And when they last, I guess 2 times ago, they've done it quite a bit recently, and they're going to do it again. But when they updated the maps, every city was given a copy of a map that showed you the projections for sea level rise. Okay, this was huge, but what happened here anyway is it was with little fanfare. Everybody, each entity, each city, county, whatever, you had to look at the map during your meetings and
They made you look at the map?
Yeah, you had to vote that you had, gone through this process to see. However, what didn't happen, which would have been better, was if there had been public involvement. So people were like, oh yeah, okay, so everything under 3 feet is going to be underwater. Okay, that's great. Next. It's like talking about cancer or something like that. It's like talking about something that's really uncomfortable, and people don't want to. They think they're going to curse themselves. I think what people feel like here is that, oh, it's not happening here. It's happening in Miami Beach, and it's happening in the Keys, and it's happening in some places in Broward and Palm Beach because they have this consortium, and we know. But it's not quite here yet. And we know, like here in Souls Point, our little teeny town, which is a microcosm of the rest of the state, and even looks, like you said when you saw it, like a miniature state of Florida itself, that the federal government has been discouraging building we call it the V zone, the velocity zone, for at least 10 years, 2 years before I got on the commission. And so it is happening. What will happen is they're not going to give us money, or they're going to charge us so much money to live in these areas that people won't be able to do it anymore. And you can't find private insurance. And most people, even people who've got really thick bank accounts, they say to themselves, this is asinine.